Welcome everybody to our today's ComAI lecture, which we are organizing together with a Presseclub here. So besides Semke, it's the Presseclub who is host of this event. Today with a very special guest, Claes Vreese from University of Amsterdam. I think at least the ones of you who are from media and communications know him. He was ICA president from 20 to 21.
During the pandemic. Great
During
year.
the pandemic, the best. But basically, you organized somehow the best conference then coming 2 years later in Australia. So it was a tough time, I think, for being president. But I think besides that, that's the reason many of you might know him. You should also know him from his research. He's one of the great experts when it comes to questions of AI, public communication and democracy. And there, Claes Vreese is also heading, now I have to check the exactly name, Algo SOC, Public Values in Algorithmic Society. So it's a 10 years national research program, which is collaborating somehow a bit with our ComAI research unit. Claes Vreese is a professor of artificial intelligence and society with a special focus on media and democracy at University of Amsterdam, and besides that, chair in political communication at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, ASCOR. We are very proud to have you here with a talk on the AI effect, how generative AI is reshaping discussions about elections and democracy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andreas, for the invitation, and it's great to be here, and it's also wonderful to travel to a place that has equally bad weather as we do in Amsterdam. So no, all kidding aside, I'm very happy to be here. This has been a talk that has had a bit of preparation time to find a time to make it here, but in a way it turned out to be, I think, a perfect timing, because what I want to talk about today is what kind of transition we're in the middle of when it comes to AI developments, and in particular generative AI developments and elections. And 2024 turns out to be a very interesting year to talk more about that. So going back already a number of years, and yes, AI is not exactly new, and neither is democracy, and it's not the first time that someone had something smart to say about AI and democracy. And back in 2017, in fact, before the current AI wave, and definitely before anyone had said ChatGPT, an Oxford University-based paper already said that there were some potential benefits to what AI technologies could do to democratic processes and democratic institutions, but there were definitely also some downsides, and unless we would get it right, it might end up being rather a disturbing and a destructive force to democracy rather than something that is positive and constructive. I think where we then are today, towards the end of 2024, is to start peeling some of those big headlines a little bit apart and unpack what it is that we are exactly talking about when we talk about the impact of AI on democracy. Because it has been quite the year. I don't know whether we should call it the election year or the election fear, because the headlines were really dramatic. And I just want to take you first back a few months in time to the sort of end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024 to set the scene, to say what were we actually looking into in 2024. We had foreign affairs, talking about AI's threat to democracy and how cybersecurity and AI-powered technologies would really be a challenge to the 2024 US presidential elections. I've just come back from being in the United States for the elections, and let me already spoil the preview and say I don't think AI was their biggest problem in those elections, but the headlines were really strong at the beginning of the year. The Guardian here, 2024 will be the overall litmus test of AI's effects on elections and voters' faith in them, so also bringing in what AI might actually do to perceptions of electoral integrity. And maybe my sort of favorite dramatic headline came from actually the Washington Post. AI deepfakes threaten to upend global elections. No one can stop them. So this was in April of this year, right? So not that many months ago. And I think this was really sort of both the popular discussion as well as maybe some of the sort of tech expectations going into this. And some of these headlines also came in the wake of big developments, obviously, in the technology, but also around the time when some of the captains of industry were writing very dramatic letters about how AI would also upend, humanity and our life on this planet. So why not also democracy, right? And for each of the letters that were written by captains of industry in the AI space, in the days that followed, you actually saw some of the biggest investments in the AI industry in the United States following. So one can also, I think, fairly bring into question what the role of these letters were, but also maybe what the role of media were when it comes to covering issues around AI. And I want to return to that in a second. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, so here we are, it's the end of November, that's 2024. Maybe democracy is not, generally speaking, in a great shape, but it was not maybe AI that ended up throwing everything out the window in the year of 2024. So, early evening, we're done, that's the take-home message, and that's it. But I also want to pose sort of a counter argument to that and say, okay, it's probably hard to come up with the smoking AI gun. And if I say to you, name me one election in 2024 where the expectation was that it would go this direction and a AI generated deep fake in the last 24 hours of the campaign went viral and pushed the election in all likelihood in the other direction, then I don't think we get a lot of sort of evidence at the table showing that disruptive and upending nature of AI. But on the other hand, I could also pose the following question and say, who can mention an election in 2024 where there was no case of the use of AI in the election campaign or no debate about the role that it played? And I think both of these challenges can be true at the same time. So it's also, I think, illustrative to go through some of these examples that are there and say that, whether or not we were looking at elections in Taiwan, in Pakistan, in India, elections in Mexico and in the Netherlands, you see that in all of these elections there were instances of the use of AI technologies by the campaigns, and some of them were definitely better than others, and some of them are more sort of on the cheap side of things. Some of them are very visual in expression. Some of them use chatbots more to actually utilize sound and speech as a feature. Some of them created poor imagery. But it is simply the case that in most elections that were held in this super election year of 2024, AI technologies were deployed. Some of them were deployed in weird ways, right? And that's also part of the discussion that some of it was satire, and that makes us maybe think about some of this in a different light than it is when it is a message about your opponent or an actual political message. I really failed to understand the Trump campaign's usage of AI images to suggest that Taylor Swift had endorsed Trump, as if that would go under the radar and not be debunked relatively quick. But in the last days, and this is an example from just when I was visiting there was also a steady stream of AI-generated messages going around, suggesting that ballot boxes were burning, that election locations were sort of under attack. And all of this was part of a grander narrative that was being pushed relatively aggressively to suggest that electoral integrity and the fairness of the elections was really at play to sort of have that narrative up and running and prepared in case the vote may have panned out differently than it did. It was also really interesting to see some of the graphs suggesting how much buzz there was around electoral integrity as a topic that basically sort of had faded by 9 o'clock California time and midnight East Coast time, when it was clear what way the the count was going, then all of a sudden that was not a topic anymore. So again, I think one of the examples to say, did it tip the election? By no means. Was it part of the election campaign? Absolutely. And it was so also earlier in the campaign when there were discussions about what the sort of fairness and good way of deploying AI technologies would be on the side of the campaigns. And many of you may also have seen already very early in the campaign when Biden voice was used to generate donations for the political campaigns. And I think that's also some of the sort of interesting uncharted territory that AI technologies do bring to us, because not before had we seen a massive use of voice-generated messaging. And that's something that I think those of us who study political communication, it's just not really been on our radar, that's next to the visual and the text and the sort of video parts of it is also part of this discussion. So here we are, end of November. We started with the "no one can stop them" super dramatic headline from the Washington Post, and then Time magazine came out just a few days ago and said, "Oh, okay, it was pretty underwhelming, everything that happened." And I think that is sort of where we are right now, and both of these headlines can be a little bit correct and a little bit incorrect, or it can be somewhere in the middle. I saw another article saying, well, so what is it? Where is AI today? Is it the magic wand, or is it part of the toolbox? And I think that sort of the conclusion at the end of 2024 is that we are somewhat closer to it's part of the toolbox than to the absolute magic wand, and that is maybe the assessment that we have here at the end of 2024. And again, depending on how you judge a field like that, you can either say, okay, fine, so not that much new under the sun, let's go home, and we still have so many other things to worry about in the world. And in terms of campaign research, this is now just part of it. I also think there's good reason to really think through what is that we are talking about. And again, I said the smoking AI gun example, can you flip the election with an AI-generated message that goes viral in the last days of the campaign and persuade the right number or the right locations of voters to affect the outcome? That's a very high bar, actually, for any technology or for any media epoch to think about it. So maybe we are also not doing ourselves a service if we think about that being the most important place to look. But if we think through what a campaign entails and how AI plays into these different roles, it becomes, in my view, a little bit more interesting. Many campaigns have started using AI rather vividly in their updates to their own constituencies. If you are a campaign organization, you need to produce a lot of content. A lot of it is rather formulaic and mundane in nature. You want to update on where your candidates are and the events and what's happening and what's being said. You want to summarize speeches that were given. That's stuff that AI and generative AI lends itself wonderfully to do in a fast and an efficient and fairly reliable manner. We've seen the donation examples in the US and in other places where donations play a role. They're not big, for example, in the Netherlands or in Denmark, but in those places where they do, you can craft messages at mass, at a low cost, targeted to potential donor groups relatively easily, and it is being done. I think one of the really interesting cases is to try and dive into some of the cases where AI messaging was being part of putting air to an already existing fire, regardless of whether that's a discussion about climate change or immigration or any of other sort of big political, already existing cleavages or discussions in a place. One thing that AI can do is to lower the threshold of producing content that buys into those narratives and those existing conflict lines and emotional cleavages that are already there. And there are accounts on some platforms that are primarily putting around AI-generated images or short clips that simply feed into these narratives of existing conflicts and emotions. Targeting of already marginalized groups it has been a feature, creating these doubts about whether or not the election is happening in this free and fair fashion, what the actual election rules are, when polling stations are open, how advanced voting might actually work. All of these things are areas in which the technology can be used maybe with more, what shall we say, effect or impact than it is necessarily only in persuading the final group of voters. Interestingly enough, this part here, which I think was part of the big fear in the beginning about a year ago, was that it would be this machinery of production about what it is that is wrong with the opposing candidate and smear campaigns and making suggestions about the opponents. I think that's actually been one of the things that we and in the monitoring that we have done have maybe seen less of that could have been expected, because also that would have been a relatively easy one. But all of that is simply to say that it's important to unpack that proposition that AI is really effective on influencing elections, and it's important to unpack the proposition when saying they're actually not that impactful on elections. Because once we start looking at these different dependent variables or these different areas of research or these different elements of the campaign, the story obviously becomes also more nuanced. And it does so also because, and that is simply important, I think, for those in the room that like communication studies, it's also because it brings together really a multitude of modalities that we usually study either in relative sort of separation to each other, and it brings in, I think, especially an element of utilizing sound and voice that we are usually not that attuned to, neither in our research nor in our thinking. But that is what it also makes it interesting from a communication science perspective. One more caveat to be said maybe is also that when thinking about the impact on elections and on democracy, broadly speaking, that it's not only about politicians, it's also about the role that it plays vis-a-vis other democratic institutions and actors, and whether or not these are actors that are more downstream in the electoral cycle. So not only the front runners, it is no surprise that if there's a deep fake about Keir Starmer or Donald Trump, that there is a relative sort of big set of eyes on that campaign all the time. So the debunking, the discussion about the authenticity of that material is very quick to appear. That might be much less the case if you are looking at more downstream races or races that are more local, where, especially in a time where local and regional journalism is less strong, there might also be less attention to these candidates. And likewise, there are also other players and institutions in a democracy that are important when it comes to this space, and whether or not these are around targeting journalists or scholars like us, or the judiciary. Those are important elements to think through, and maybe there's been a little bit too much focus on the sort of the top level candidates, the leading politicians, the candidates that are either up for the presidency or for the prime ministership, for example. And all of these changes are part of what you could say that there's a wider sort of AI stack at stake here. And I've put up some of the questions, and these are more questions than answers because I think we're in the middle of these transitions and questions right now. So first of all, we have a number of new players on the block, such as OpenAI, but we also have a number of companies that were not AI companies 5 years ago, but are morphing into AI companies, right? And they are, by now, part of the election discussion. So, for example, OpenAI and Gemini, these companies at the beginning of 2024 were rather adamant in saying, we have guardrails and we have rules and we have made sure that our products cannot be used for political purposes. It was a bit unclear what was actually meant by these promises, and there was some research over the course of 2024 that also demonstrated that if you wanted to, for example, use these chatbots and large language models to devise campaigns, you could quite easily do so. We did an experiment right before the European elections, and in one of the prompts, if you said, design for me a campaign where you want to depress turnout amongst specific groups of voters, you got a 10-point very good playbook on how actually to do that. Of course, you can say, yeah, that you still needed to create the content and you need to distribute it and you still need to put it into practice. But the fact that there was all of a sudden a helpful tool that would point you to exactly some of the things from the populist playbook or other playbooks on what you have to do in order to devise a campaign. That is part now of AI companies that are part of the election campaign. The social media companies are still, of course, very central. And one I think that the most heard arguments about, well, what is AI changing? Yes, you can produce more content and you can do it faster and maybe more targeted and more realistically than you could before, but you still need the distribution of it. And there is definitely a certain truth to that. But of course, you can also leverage some of the technologies in terms of having bots and accounts that will then carry some of the targeted content to it. I think it's an open question to the effectiveness, but it's also an open question to what the social media companies will do in this space. Again, at the beginning of the year, they were very adamant about saying we will invest a lot to have labeling and make it transparent if there's AI-generated content on our platforms. And over the course of the year, that has already changed a lot because they say, well, that's now too complicated. And what does it even mean that something is AI generated? Because by now, if you use Word, that's actually already an AI product because it automatically finishes the sentence. So how would you even do that? So you know what? Our new approach is to just throw it into our terms of services so that if you are the end user, you're responsible for marking your content as AI generated. So it's no longer on them, but it's on the end user. And this is just within the course of a year, right? And this is still very open also with new regulation and legislation coming in this space. The parties and the candidates, I think we touched a little bit about on it. I had not expected, to be quite honest, that some of the most active use of generative AI in elections in 2024 would come from actual political parties and candidates. It would have seemed more natural to me that there would have been third-party actors that would leverage this technology more rather than the actual candidates and the parties themselves. And we are right now in a situation where some parties are also, with their parliaments, going through a period of reflection saying, is it perhaps an idea to have a code of conduct or a set of ground rules on what we do with these technologies in our campaign, ranging from we don't use them at all, or we use them but we are transparent about them, or we only use them in, say, in-party, in-group materials, so to say something about what it is that we do and what we stand for, but not about opponents. Several parliaments are going through this discussion right now, and that makes it interesting because then you also see that it becomes a politicized issue because not necessarily all political parties are in agreement that you need a set of code of conduct on this topic. But this is definitely, I think, part of that stack that we are seeing. Then we have the role of traditional media. It's also been a really interesting one in 2024. I alluded a little bit to it by mentioning the coverage of the media also on some of the letters from the captains on industry, what AI can do. But the media really play a sort of a multitude or a multifaceted role here, because on the one hand, they have new opportunities to use this technology in research and to use it as sort of tools in uncovering big amounts of data that they maybe did not have access to in the past. They also have the challenge of covering AI as a new technology and as an evolving technology and as a part of maybe elections and democracy, which is not necessarily something that most current journalists were taught in journalism school, because it is a new topic. And obviously there's also this amplification challenge. If you look at those headlines from the beginning of 2024, and it's not from some, local school paper, this AI will upend the elections. That's the Washington Post. So I think that's really also a challenge for our traditional media and journalism in striking a right balance in terms of covering these various topics. And another open question is what it does to us as voters and as citizens. There are fantastic uses of AI and chatbot technologies in terms of having new interactive voter tools where you can learn a lot from, and you can do it in a much more conversational manner and just not taking the valometer and sort of answering some questions and being plotted into some kind of two-dimensional space on where you are vis-a-vis the parties, but doing so in a more informative and conversational and maybe also linguistically accessible manner are great ways of using these technologies. So maybe there's a great potential for engagement here. What does it do, though, also to sort of trust both of parties and in media, also open questions. And then we have, I think, a very interesting thing that also made 2024 very special was that we were sort of on the way into getting some of the first regulation on this space. So on the one hand, especially in Europe, of course, the push has been to try and regulate the online space more. And the Digital Services Act was the first step, which had some provisions, but did not necessarily capture all of these things, though there was a push, especially around the European elections in June, to say, okay, let's try and extrapolate from those principles of the DSA and come up with some guidelines for how you conduct good and fair elections, also in a situation with a lot of digital contributions and AI. And then you have the EU AI Act coming, and interesting case in point too, because when that was being, but I think you had a talk recently on that, so that MEP was probably much more capable of also speaking to how interesting that was, especially when it comes to the role of AI around media and democracy, because generative AI basically wasn't part of the initial negotiations, and then it came and they had to renegotiate. But even where do we then stand today? If we look at, for example, the provisions around media in the AI Act, you can look at it in two very different ways. You can look at it in a way of saying the media are kind of in a good position because as long as they have a human editor in the very end, signing off for whatever piece of production that is being done, whether it's text or a podcast or whatever, as long as there's a human in the loop, there's a human editor at the end, then they actually don't have to do an awful lot to comply with the AI Act in terms of risk assessment. Then you're not in any of the higher groups of the AI Act on the risk assessment. So on the one hand, you could say as journalistic media with the human in the loop, and a production cycle where there's always an editor signing off to the final piece before it goes to print or online. Nothing to worry about, business as usual. We don't even have to adapt how we produce content. And on the other hand, we know also a lot of media companies that said, well, we would actually have liked a little more guidance here in terms of what is and what is not allowed or expected. But open question. So here again, I think that's the sort of the status where we are in November 2024. No smoking AI gun, if that's what you were looking for as part of this year, but also a suggestion to really look relatively more broadly and say, let's unpack what a campaign needs and what actors are involved, and let's think through what AI can do to these different actors, and there can maybe be areas in which that impact is big, and there can be areas where that impact is more modest. But generally speaking, it's also safe to conclude generative AI tools are now simply part of the campaign toolbox, to the same extent that many other things are in that toolbox, and that we also know from a lot of great research on campaigns that a lot of campaigns are still very low-key, low-tech, low-cost, pretty amateuristic. But AI is now in that toolbox, and one of the features of AI is that you actually don't need a lot of skills. You don't need a lot of money to put some of these in place, but it is in the toolbox. And we are going into a period of time where regulation will kick in, but in rather unpredictable ways, right? Because both the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and the AI Act are these big and rather framework types of regulation, and the devil is in the details. So the devil will be in the first cases of when someone sees a violation or wants to bring a specific case into a judgment of whether that was within the scope or not. So that's the 2024 status. And I also said, okay, what will happen next? I have no idea, but here are a few things that I at least want to think about going forward. So for let's say if we would do this talk again in November 2025, I think we will have been thinking more about these topics as well. So first of all, the media challenge. I alluded a little bit to it already, that it really is this sort of, the media play a special role in this space because these are all the things that it can and already is being used for in some media companies. And while Andreas was mentioning the 10-year research program that we have in Amsterdam, we also have a lab that is a little bit more hands-on, where we work with local and national media companies on how they use AI. And some of them are extremely cautious and have hardly done anything with it. And some of them are going all in and basically have real content produced, published, and put on their website without any flagging of the content being AI generated. So the whole range is there in front of us. But needless to say that it can be used for sort of all kind of back office things. It can be used for really interesting research tools. This one, I think, is one that we have seen in some of the studies with media companies that's really interesting, sort of lead generation. If you have big, massive, boring stacks of documents, such as Bremen municipality meetings, that an AI tool is a great identifier of what could be potentially interesting cases for local media. Where might there be some contention in these documents? What are some of the topics? What are some of the leads on these stories? The production of actual content, a whole new generation of devising graphical contributions. So these are all things that the media themselves do, and are challenged also in drawing a line on where they want to deploy these technologies, how transparent they want to be, how much they want to sort of unite with their audience in making a new pact of what is a journalistic product, maybe going forward, also with the use of AI. Again, here I think also a place where the thinking moves relatively fast. I remember being at conferences in early 2024 where there was a lot of emphasis on disclosure, labeling, making sure that media companies, journalistic companies showcase when they do these kind of things. And by now, I think the needle, at least in the industry, has really moved to, but this is truly impossible because it is now part of so many elements of the production chain. So the question is, was it a meaningful or a big or a defining feature of creating this story? Because somewhere in the production chain, there's a really big chance that some degree of AI technology was part of the production. So this is an area that I think is for a lot of communication students and journalism students, of course, of particular importance, but also one where the needle is moving really fast. Platform ownership. Some of the prominent scholars in the world are sitting in the audience on some of these topics. But let's just say that this topic is back with a whole new dimension, right? I really do not think that we have truly understood what this means. The fact that Musk bought Twitter in 2022 with one of the claims being that Twitter was too political. And that need to be freed to give a space for true free speech. And here we are in November 2024 and have just witnessed an election where X is now de facto a state medium. I think that really takes our thinking about ownership structures and the question, what if any guardrails there even are for some of these alliances between big tech billionaires and politics. This is an extreme example, I know, but the underlying principles and that relationship between politics, tech, and money is something that is not new, but maybe also deserves a little bit of revisiting in an era of AI, seeing that Musk is also one of the biggest investors and developers of AI technologies. I think we're also in for a interesting ride. I don't know if any of you are also doing work around disinformation, for which obviously AI is also an interesting feature of research. And we have seen already in the past years, especially in the United States, but increasingly also as part of political discussions in Europe, a attempt to reframe mis- and disinformation discussions as part of a stifling of free speech. And let's just say that movement is, if anything, very likely to intensify over the next years. We already have colleagues in the field who work on these topics and who have gone from having had public outcries about the work that they do to having to turn in, because of being indicted and being sued in the US, to have to turn in their entire email correspondence and personal messaging because Republicans have sued them in the states that they are, and their home universities are extremely protective in the first 24 hours. And then basically want the problem to go away, and then you are a single researcher working on maybe AI and disinformation, and then it turns out that our institutions are also not the ones with the greatest sort of boundaries and support systems when it comes to this. This discussion, there are, I should think about the recording. There are multiple political entrepreneurs in Europe that have also thought about this being an interesting way of almost criminalizing research and NGO work in this field. And I am afraid that 2025 and after will only bring us more of this. 2025, I think, will also be a next page in the discussions about how do we think about AI literacy, media literacy, digital literacy, and now AI literacy. What does it mean? How do we think about it? What kind of answers do we have as a media and communication community to these instruments? And there are a lot of scholars who are thinking about this, but I think it is now the time for the little quiz. Which of these two is an AI-generated image and which is a non-AI generated image? So how many believe that this is AI-generated? With some hesitation, it is, and the other is not. This one, let me see, how many believe that the right-hand side is AI-generated? A third, and how many the left? Also a third, and then there's a third with no opinion. This is the AI-generated one. Is the Thai picture the AI-generated one? Show of hands. It is. So the point of these three is simply to say that, again, a year ago, when we thought about AI images, the idea was very much, oh, look for the third leg, the sixth finger, the odd thing out in the picture. There is actually a little bit of it here, but it's not easy, right? I believe that this discussion is over. This is not the AI literacy that will bring this forward. We all consume our information on screens that are super small. It goes super fast. The technology is already at a point where this is not helpful. But what then? What then will be part of that AI literacy discussion? Another topic for the agenda is what not so much what is correct and what is truthful, but what has been made by a human being versus what has been auto-generated. Does that then become part of the discussion if we are already moving in the discussion as to whether or not it is worth labeling if something has been in part generated by AI? Is it worth thinking about flagging when something has been made fully by humans? Is that going to be a feature of quality journalism going forward? If the sports, the finances that was already potentially taken part of or taken care of by the robo-journalism, if that moves to more formulaic things, is there then a human premium? And how do we know that parts of content is not taken out of context or is correct? How do we know that not necessarily if a picture is that we agree with the picture or not, but that we know that it is at least a picture that was taken in the Presse Club in Bremen on this very night? And how can we leverage some of the technology in also having an authentication marker or a watermark to travel with that picture? Again, not to say that this was part of a truthful story, but at least it was a picture that came from this location at this very day. Also big open question. AI and disinformation is also one where there might be a huge discrepancy between the scope of the problem and our perceptions of the problem. So here's some data from a study that we did. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to say that when we looked at the free pictures, we used that as part of a conjoint experiment, and it was good to see that your distribution was pretty much the distribution also of the participants in the study. They were, a little bit better than chance, to sort of say it bluntly, in identifying the AI-generated images. And I think you, of course, scored a little better than that. But just to say that part also sort of scaled in a study how difficult this is. This is data from a survey that we did in Denmark, and it said, okay, let's think about generative AI and let's think about some of the places in which there is maybe optimism about what it can do and where it can do well, and some of the places where it might cause more worries than anything else. And what came out here, and I even have some of the Danish titles here for you, but the big important part is that if you look at the pink scores, at the very top you see things like development of new technology and the use of AI in the health sector and for sort of creative processes. There's very little negative impact seen and the perception of this being maybe something that can bring something good. But once you come down to areas around the trustworthiness of politics and the trustworthiness of the news media and what it does with democratic processes, that's where you get to areas in which there is, at least in the eye of the public, much more to worry about. And of course, we are still, I think, in a situation where the jury is out on how big that worry should really be. But let's say going into that discussion, this is at least some of the areas in which public see the biggest worries. With the European Digital Media Observatory, there was an attempt to sort of monitor the proportion of discussion of AI-generated disinformation, and this was done by fact checkers that looked at the proportion of articles that dealt with AI as a topic or as a source of disinformation, and you can see these are percentage here on the left-hand side. So very, very little of the articles that dealt with something that had to be fact-checked was actually originated in something that was AI-generated. So you could ask, what are we even looking at here, right? In June 23, it was a year before the European elections, and the European Commission narrative going into the election was that democracy was at stake for 2024, and maybe it was up to about 5% of those fact-checked articles that had an origin in AI-generated material. So that's just to say that there is maybe a sort of a distinction in the perception between what we can find and what we're looking at and what is being perceived as a big problem. And I think that also shows in a study that we did around the EP elections here in 2024, where we had surveys actually here in Germany and in the Netherlands and in Poland, and we had that over time during the course of the campaign, and there was an overall increase in the perception on the side of citizens, and this is about 1,000 people in each country, that they had been seeing generative AI-based disinformation over the course of the campaign. Especially Germans and Dutch citizens were most concerned about generative AI in the election cycle, whereas Polish citizens reported having encountered less AI-generated disinformation over the course of the campaign. And right before the elections, that sort of the perception in all places rose, but at different levels. And this is an off-log sentence. Let me just make sure I say it rightly. That for those individuals who had a perception that they had also been encountering more AI-generated disinformation over the course of the campaign, they also had an idea that the integrity of the elections was less to worry about, so that was in order, which is a really triggering finding that we are still trying to wrap our heads around. But the point here is that those that encountered the AI-generated images, most of them also identified it coming from political parties and politicians themselves. So I just show these results because it's a relatively recent study that we did, but also to tap a little bit into this potential discrepancy between the public worry on the one hand and the kind of evidence that we see, because none of these countries, according to the study done by EDMO, there was a huge amount of AI-generated disinformation during the campaign, and if anything, there was most of it in Poland, but a bigger worry in Germany and the Netherlands. So I think that there's some unresolved work to dive into in that space. And for 2025, as I also said, it will be interesting. 2024 was interesting because de facto it was the year where there were so many elections. Germany is doing its best to now throw one more election in for early 2025. But 2024 was seen as the super election year with almost half the world population going to the polls. But it was also the year where none of this was particularly well regulated. In some areas of the world, no regulation whatsoever. 2024 will be different because we will see the AI Act kicking in first part. The DSA will be more in place. It is very uncertain what US legislation in this space will now be like under a Trump administration. China was relatively far in a relatively restrictive sort of AI regulation that almost went further than some of the EU regulation on that topic. But 2025 will be a year where a lot of this kicks in. And the final, because I promised more questions than answers in this lecture, is that as much as citizens indicate being troubled by the use of AI when it comes to media and politics and democracy, they are also hugely inconsistent when they are then being asked to think through about what they would do themselves with this technology. So another study that we have just concluded, we had sort of the imaginary situation of when, for example, you would think it would be okay to use generative AI to persuade others and distribute information. And generally speaking, the concerns are pretty high, and you sort of, on average, you all think it's a bad idea. But then, if it is on a topic that you find important, then all of a sudden you actually think it's okay, because then maybe it is something that is implicitly being seen as maybe it's something that can help persuade or move others on that topic. And it doesn't matter so much as to whether or not you are ideologically leaning one way or another, or whether you think that immigration is a big problem, or you think that climate change is a big problem. If you believe it's a big or an important topic, you are more inclined to find it okay to use that technology in order to create a narrative and in a messaging of your own. So not only is there maybe a gap between perceptions and reality here that I think need to probe into more, but there is also a really interesting phenomenon going on with underneath this general, it's all very scary and it could be bad for democracy in general, that there is a double standard in saying we don't want it, actually. We like some regulation here, but as long as I find that topic important and I want to persuade some others, I'm a little bit more inclined to go with it and also use it. So that I think is also a big topic to probe into in 2025. Okay, this was a lot, and that was intentionally so, because the idea was we would meet here at the end of 2024 and do a review. When we arranged the talk, we didn't know whether democracy had fallen to pieces. Maybe it has in some places, but it was not maybe due to AI. On the other hand, I think my sort of final message would be no, AI did not upend democracy in 2024, but there's hardly an election campaign to be thought of from now on where AI technology is also not part of the campaign toolbox. And I think I'll then stop there and then we can open up for questions. Thank you. Yeah, so I think a question with many layers, because I think part of the question is also a little bit of the weaponization of the term, right? So now we came out of a number of years where if you didn't like something, you just say, but it's fake news. And now you can say, but this is AI generated or something, that it has this sort of also at the meta level that you can discount anything that you may not agree with by simply saying it's probably not real. It's probably been made by AI. And I think that is definitely already happening also in sort of public discourse here. I think the other part is, and that was almost one of the, when thinking about what to talk about here, because there is also something interesting in this that sort of fits a broader discussion maybe. There was a time where a blatant lie, if discovered, would be something that would be harmful. And somehow we are in a period of time where that is less self-evident that is necessarily a problem. If you either kind of believe it, even though it was a lie, or if you believe the underlying argument, because you said, well, but it could have actually been somewhat correct. And I think that's in the second part of the question is somewhere where this fits into, right? So if a campaign would portray a group of voters or a group of citizens or a political candidate with AI imagery, the fact that then becomes fact-checked or debunked or becomes evident that this was AI generated and not authentic, but if the imagery fits into an imagery of either, open borders or climate catastrophes, but that fits into pre-existing narratives, then it's much less clear actually how much damage there is in it not being authentic. And so I think it feeds into that topic of that you can add sort of air to an ongoing and already existing and often emotionally charged conflict line that is there. And then it adds this odd layer of maybe something that squares a bit with that last study what we did, where we were a little bit surprised that if you find a topic personally important, that you're also more inclined yourself to say, it's actually not so bad that you deploy these technologies if you can then create something that's persuasive or not. So you said something interesting. So it's a super good question, but you said the only difference is that we can now generate the image. I think that is still a huge difference because, of course, in all image or in all photojournalism, there was always a discussion of what is the right angle, what is the right sort of cut of an overall image that you have. You only saw what you get. You could crop it in different ways. I think that those ethical dilemmas are laid out and somehow press and media have standards and ideas about how to do that, and then we can debate whether they have always been successful or whether they have been pursuing sometimes specific agendas and these kind of things, but that at least there is a discussion about it also from a professional point of view. I would also say that there is a big difference between us having this as the overall wall-to-wall, so not much more can actually be possible. And then I could crop something that would either make the room seem extremely full or half empty, and that is definitely a fair and debatable thing. But that is potentially something that's very different from me generating a room showing that no one showed up at all to the lecture tonight. And there is a difference there between a selection out of something that has an origin and that has a degree of authenticity versus something that is blatantly a fantasy. But again, if I could create an image, I could also have created an image that looks fairly much like the room today. That's, of course, also possible. But for sure, the technology can be primarily used to also create generated. Let me maybe say it this way to your question. If this current technology had been around when Trump was inaugurated for the first time, and how many people had showed up, and we all remember that discussion and the sort of the images of the mall in Washington. Imagine having that discussion now at the back end of what we can do with generating images. I think that to me is maybe the difference here. Yeah, I will distill a question out of that very good comment because I think it's a very relevant point. We maybe in academia now have a sense of that, but there's too much going on. But I would tend to say, yeah, there's a lot going on, but a lot of that funding is going to hardcore development of AI technologies and is very much used in the hard sciences. I don't think that there's enough of this that is also a strong footing in social sciences and humanities research at all. So from that perspective, I think that glass is still rather half empty than half full. Another issue is it driving out funding that also needs to go to all kind of other topics, and there I think there's maybe a discussion to be had. On the other hand, we are maybe also not a sort of a average audience in terms of finding these topics interesting. There's a high degree of selectivity when you go out in the rain in Bremen on an evening to hear about AI, and the discussion that we are having here is maybe also a discussion that is already seeing, oh, where are we now, and oh, we are already coming down a little bit from the hype cycle, and do we really need to treat it as something that's that special, or is it now part also of our sort of understanding communication more broadly and these kind of things? Some of our survey research also shows that maybe the perception is that now everybody uses generative AI all the time, that is simply not the case, right? If you look at an age breakdown in a big national survey we just completed in the Netherlands, on average it's still only about 1 in 4 that has actually worked actively with these things. The age gap is humongous, right? If you look at sort of the under 25s, it's really, it's big. But big educational differences there too, and the higher you go up in the age brackets, this topic has maybe not even landed yet. And I think for them, there's still more the magic wand metaphor, because it's very hard to figure out what it is, and there's still a lot of work that has to be done. And then I would, at the end of the day, rather have that discussion, hopefully also fed by research that also has a strong social science humanities focuses. But are there path dependencies? Is some of this sort of a big data, algorithms, platform, AI, and some of the same people thinking about it? Absolutely, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, because it also prompts this kind of historical awareness. It's not as if AI dropped from the sky in November. It's almost like to the date 2 years ago, right, when ChatGPT was launched, and so inserting that skepticism, but also historical awareness, I think is also our task. But I tend to believe that I'd rather have us do a little bit too much in this space, because I do see this as a potentially bigger and more disruptive step in both our field and in society and in democracy than some other minor technologies have been in the past. Yeah, I hope that that's part of the message that I also wanted to give here, right? By setting it up very purposely, saying, okay, the headlines of the year and where we are today is probably not the right lens to see this, but let's try and break it down. And I do think that it is relevant to then think through, okay, let's take a campaign and unfold it from the beginning of the end. Who are the actors involved? What are the processes involved? And where in some cases, can it play a significant role, and where may it not be a very important part of it? I think that is exactly the task of where we are right now. I didn't talk about it today, but in the program that we have in Amsterdam, there's also work that is not only about AI, but also work that looks, for example, at some of this in the justice sector, where a lot of it is being implemented, predictive policing, but then not just on the basis of what you could say that there's a sort of an algorithmic search for prior cases that are similar, but actually taking the judiciary and proposing sentences, for example. That's an experiment in the judiciary that is taking place. We are looking at it in the health sector, and there I think their dynamics, their instruments, and their topics of inquiry are so very different. So in the judiciary and in the police, you see experimentation and a lot of caution. I think media and democracy is maybe somewhere in the middle if you compare to the health sector, where this is being deployed very strongly, and that differentiation I think is equally important. But in a way, it is also our task, at least in the public-facing part of our work, to exactly have this conversation and try and interject and say, okay, maybe a headline suggesting that it upends and that it is an unstoppable force is not the right headline for the Washington Post to run in April 2024, because it is not as if there's anything just injecting AI technologies in a political campaign. There's a lot of human agency there, and there were a lot of differences with the countries and in the types of political actors that went with it or not. But it's also true to say that, say, for example, in India and Pakistan, it was used a lot more. It was used hugely in Indonesia to write political speeches in their elections. And in India, you had a case of an evoked deceased candidate being re-invoked. So just to say that differentiation that I think you are pointing to is exactly the right one to have. And I hope that that's also one of the takeaway messages here, to not say it's the one or the other, but rather, well, it depends very much on where in the process, where in that stack you're looking, and that there are examples where it maybe have a bigger impact, but there might also be examples where it is a marginal impact.
If I may put me on the list at this point and link what you just said back to your talk. So there were 2 points I found interesting. So the one point was the metaphor of the toolbox, the other point of the human in the loop. And my question is, don't we have to think one step further? So the point I want to make is the underlying argument of a lot of research on AI from social sciences at the moment is to say, well, there is AI and there's the human. This is like internet research or web research, let's say in the 1990s. There's online, there's offline. And this is how it started. And I'm really wondering if this is the point about AI. So these technologies, I would say they are from the beginning so much entangled with human practices. The way they are appropriated is so much entangled with everyday practice, in journalism, whatever. Yeah. You cannot say in journalism today, where is AI and where isn't. Yeah. It's really already part of, and partly even the journalists don't know what the system is doing with them. So I'm really wondering if we would not have to move more to this perspective of putting much more emphasis on what was called human-machine symbiosis and understanding AI from that perspective, instead of having a look at AI as something somehow
external,
separated.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point. I think when I used the human in the loop, and I did it to denote actually the logic of the AI Act. So not necessarily my preference for saying this is a useful distinction, but the human in the loop was invoked as the way out, or the easy way for media companies to deal with AI requirements, whether it's about transparency or declaration of the toolbox. That has now been determined that if that human is there at the end, whatever that mean, but there's someone saying, okay, we print it, now we put it online, now the podcast is dropped. That then covers your responsibility, but also your legal liability. But even in the current day journalism, you can ask, how active is that role of an editor really for every single part of the product that then comes out? And is that, how much of that is now changing, if there has been a process where that interwovenness between the technology and the human production is now hardly separable? So I don't think that I would necessarily say that it's my preferred sort of distinction, but it is the distinction that is now being put into, let's say, elevated thinking about this topic, because that's also going to be the legal distinction. On the intertwinedness, and I'm always also a little skeptical of some of the sort of anthropomorphic features of technologies. So I think you have a right point saying it's not a useful distinction to say it's one or the other when it's a combination. But there's also a danger that we somehow end up ascribing some very human-like characteristics to that technology, and that's a part of the literature that I sometimes find a bit problematic, because I find that part of the literature is also feeding into the actual human intelligence attribution to some of these technologies, where I'm not sure that's good either. So I guess I'm a little torn on that topic still.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I have no idea. I will also be very honest and say that I caught up relatively late with that news, so I will not pretend to have any knowledge of neither the Romanian case nor whether AI was part of the campaign. We have within ETMO, we have had over the year, in the European Digital Media Observatory, there are national and regional hubs, and in these different hubs, there are people sort of looking out for interesting cases. So I assume that in one of our next meetings we'll hear more whether or not that became a topic, but have also tried to identify the way in which this topic was part of the campaign or not. And in some, there were elections where the technology was deployed, but it was not discussed. There were elections where it was discussed, but not really visibly very much deployed. And then you had the combination of both. But I don't know where sort of the Romanian case now comes down. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. I don't see any further question, if I'm right. So let's stop at that point. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
coming.
much.